couple of weeks back, I walked into a cinema to watch Star Wars: The Last Jedi, a film that had at that point been described by critics as the greatest thing since sliced bread, the one of the best Star Wars of all time, certainly. And I was excited. I think I had the right mindset walking into the film. What followed did not meet the expectations set. In this review, I'm going to go through a number of things. We're going to look at the different facets of filmmaking, in particular plot, characters, themes, and cinematography. Before we get into the specifics, though, we're going to go through some general stuff to do with the Star Wars universe, what The Last Jedi does, some of the choices it makes, some of the choices Rian Johnson clearly made. And we'll start with the world building. There's none at any stage. I'm actually kind of flabbergasted. Both Force Awakens and The Last Jedi do not seem to be interested in world building. I mean, consider the first scene of A New Hope. You've got a dagger-like, gigantic spaceship chasing down what seems to be a much smaller, weaker vessel. And it tells you a lot instantly. It tells you of a power relationship where you've got an authoritarian, powerful, warlike, militaristic empire chasing down the plucky rebels. Within 30 seconds, the film shows you a great deal without actually saying anything. The angling of the shot, with the Star Destroyer coming from above menacingly and its triangular, sinister shape, tells us who we're dealing with and begins the process of creating a world. Within the scope of the first two films of the original trilogy, you find out the power structure of the Empire, you find out about its policies, you find out about many of its core ideologies, and it feels like it's part of a living, breathing world. This is a deeply fascistic, alien-hating, xenophobic empire that's authoritarian and that's easy to hate for anyone, for example, growing up after World War II and seeing many of the comparisons that can be made to Nazi Germany. These were, of course, conscious parallels being made by George Lucas and co. that were supposed to create a believable antagonist, someone that the audiences could readily identify as the bad guy. Now, when we got to J.J. Abrams' Force Awakens, he tried to put many of the same processes in place, but he made some very strange, very awkward choices. I mean, he used the same sort of camera angle shots, slightly modified, to create similar impressions of the power of the First Order. But a lot of that ancillary information that we got in the original trilogy just wasn't there in the J.J. Abrams iteration. We didn't know a lot about the First Order. We didn't know a lot about where it came from, how it came to be. We didn't know about its power structures or its relationship to the New Galactic Republic, or indeed the Resistance. We didn't know which was the more powerful and why they're the more powerful. It didn't really play out at all. The reason why I talk about all this, of course, is that the new trilogy, unfortunately, doesn't feel like a lived world. It doesn't have the detail requisite to a lived world, and for the audience, it's a bit of a hollow shell. You never really get the impression that it's anything but a deeply contrived space for the characters to inhabit while they do what they've got to do. Whereas the original trilogy had places and settings, the new trilogy has locations and background. There's simply no kind comparison to be made here between the two trilogies, and I challenge you to name an iconic place in the new films. I mean, I'd say that J.J. Abrams' Force Awakens was more successful in this than Rian Johnson's Last Jedi, but really both are culprits. So yeah, I took major issues with the world building in the new trilogy. I mean, just look at the destruction of the Republic's capital system in Force Awakens. When Alderaan was destroyed in the original trilogy, you felt the weight of it. You felt it on Leia and through Leia. Here there was no weight. There was nothing that made it a hugely impactful event. Instead, it's just a plot point. And that basically sums up the new trilogy in a way, because the world that they're establishing exists solely for the characters to inhabit and for the plot to develop in, and doesn't seem to live independently of that, which is unfortunate because the old trilogy did such a great job at creating a semi-believable world that people were interested in. Now, while the flawed world building is an issue that's applicable to both Force Awakens and Last Jedi, it starts to be genuinely annoying in Rian Johnson's film for the simple reason that you already established the characters in Force Awakens. You know the new characters at that stage. You don't need to waste screen time explaining the new characters, which means that it was an opportunity to do some honest to goodness world building that immerses you in this thing you're trying to create, this legacy you're trying to establish. But unfortunately, Rian Johnson fails to do so entirely, which kind of feeds into and is part and parcel of a much larger problem with The Last Jedi specifically. It's a film that tries to be all things to all people. In particular, here I'm referring to the wink-wink approach on the one hand, wherein, let's take the example of the Battle of Crate. You're giving the original trilogy fans a nod and a wink by situating a battle where there are AT-ATs, slightly different but familiar nonetheless. There is a trench system established by the Resistance on Crate, which appears to be a snow world hosting a lonely rebellion outpost. Hello Hoth, it's been some time. And while it's not unexpected that The Last Jedi would try to appeal to fans of the original trilogy in this way, with references that are more Empire Strikes Back based, it is disappointing that this same approach is taken to trying to appeal to pretty much every demographic that exists in the world. You have the Porgs for the kids, you have Laura Dern's Admiral Holdo for the LGBTQ community, you have misplaced humor to appeal to fans of, I suppose, the Marvel films. In essence, the film tries to have something for everybody and ends up having not a great deal for anybody. And who do you really blame for that? I mean, is it Rian Johnson himself? Or, of course, the Disney company and Kathleen Kennedy? Who bears responsibility for trying to market this film to as many audiences as humanly possible? I mean, this is not necessarily a moral judgment, but it does lead to a less effective film, and it does lead to a film that seems to have been made by committee, a marketing committee that seems to have had a major impact on the pacing of the film, what's included in it, the kind of locations, the characters involved, and a lot of the storyline, unfortunately. And while it's valid to say that the original Star Wars was essentially a vehicle for marketing toys, it did have something for other audiences without letting audience appeal dictate the most basic parameters of the film. Look, why start the film with Guardians of the Galaxy style humor? I mean, I understand what it's trying to harken back to. I understand the effect it's supposed to have on the audience, but it also entirely disarms the First Order as a threatening enemy. How can you take Hux seriously after that? How can you take the entire First Order seriously after that? They appear, and they're made to appear, as a set of bumbling buffoons who can't handle the most basic aspects of their jobs without stumbling over their own feet. There's a hidden cost to that little chuckle, and the hidden cost is that there's a lot less tension involved when it comes to the First Order because you stop seeing them as a legitimate threat to the Resistance and to the characters. This mass market approach, of course, then eventually leads us to the casino planet, which is probably the most ludicrous part of the entire film. You've got a Disney company production having a good old crack at capitalism and the failures of capitalism in the most ironic way possible, during an attempt to absolutely maximize their profits around the world. It's sad to say that I don't believe for a second that Kelly Marie Tran was hired because she was the best actress for the job, and she does an okay job. That's not a criticism of her as an actor, but I firmly believe that she was hired to appeal to the Asian market. Just look at the numbers the last film did in China. Considering the other things the film does to support its bottom line, I cannot and will not, for even one moment, believe that they're not willing to stoop that low. And that is a real indictment of Rian Johnson's filmmaking process in this case, because you've got half an hour of the film devoted to developing a character that ultimately is there for marketing. Some of that stuff will get more specific in just a little while, but suffice it to say that in a more general sense, this is a marketing exercise of a film. This is a film that fails to establish a believable world. It's plasticky, it's ersatz, it's fake, it feels artificial, and as a result, it has a lot of trouble suspending disbelief, and it has a lot of trouble immersing the audience. And it's not like I can't understand the motivation behind all this. Investing $300 million in a film and a similar amount of money in marketing means that you're going to want to get that investment back. The stakes are too high. And I'm sure that all of the people involved, all of the individuals involved, feel the weight of that pressure. The pressure that's coming down from people who aren't involved in making the film but financing it. I just don't know if they realize how transparent that approach is and how easily people start to see through it. On the other hand, it worries me that none of that stuff will matter, and that in the end, audiences will still put down $1 billion to go see a Star Wars film that's devoid of anything that made Star Wars as memorable as it is. So let's now move on to a more specific consideration of the individual filmmaking facets of Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. Firstly, plot. Now, where we last left the Star Wars universe, we had Rey finally arriving at Ahch-To, meeting Luke Skywalker, the legendary Jedi Master, and handing him his lightsaber. Meanwhile, the last embers of a dying resistance are huddled on a ragtag fleet of ships trying to escape the First Order's attack. There are obvious parallels here to both Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi, which could be an interesting approach if the film made better use of those competing strands. I mean, think about Empire Strikes Back for a second. You've got a whole series of disasters unleashed on the rebellion, on Luke Skywalker personally, on Han Solo, on Leia Organa. It's a second act which basically incorporates major character development with huge obstacles for the heroes to overcome, and it does not end on a happy note. A lot of those obstacles are only going to be overcome in The Return of the Jedi. And in broad brushstrokes, The Last Jedi patterns itself in this way, but then proceeds to subvert everything that made Empire Strikes Back impactful and so resonant with audiences. Whereas Empire Strikes Back continued the tale of Star Wars that began in A New Hope and developed its characters further, brought the plot along, created believable antagonists, etc., etc. You actually have The Last Jedi resetting the story again. What does the plot of The Last Jedi actually manage to do? Well, let's recount. It kills off some major characters. It ends Snoke as a continuing character in the new trilogy. And it, again, puts every piece back in its place the way it was at the start of the movie. The Resistance is still small and resisting, and the First Order is still large and powerful and trying to destroy the Resistance. And there really aren't many points of tension to lead into the third film with. There's no Han frozen in carbonite. There's no Luke searching for himself and his place in the world. There isn't even the sense that the Resistance is tottering in extinction, because unlike in Empire Strikes Back, the film straight up tells you that, quote unquote, this is only the beginning. Now, lots of people have criticized, and quite rightly criticized, all of the things that don't make sense in this movie. And there are tons of things that don't make sense. But I don't want to take the time to criticize those same things for the simple reason that within the scope of the film, I'm happy to suspend disbelief as long as they get the basics of the filmmaking right. And unfortunately, Rian Johnson fails to do so. The two concurrent plots are just horribly paced. And this movie is probably at least 45 minutes longer than it has any right to be. The casino scene is an absolute joke. It's a subplot meant, as I said earlier, purely to develop a new character and to give Finn something to do. The fact that there's no payoff whatsoever to that arc, and that both characters are eventually captured by the First Order as part of Rian Johnson's subversion of expectations campaign, is just a bridge too far. I mean, trolling the audience has its limits, and Rian Johnson reached those limits really early on in the film, then just kept pushing. And what you end up with is that 30-odd minutes of the film have no impact whatsoever on what actually happens in the film. Overall, the plot is, simply speaking, embarrassingly self-contained. Many of the plot points that were established in Force Awakens are seemingly consciously cast aside, while the film doesn't end on any kind of cliffhanger or anything to lead on from. Yes, Kylo Ren is now in charge of the First Order, but how is that materially different to Snoke being in charge? We don't know because the film has nothing to say about it. So whereas the plot of Empire Strikes Back feels part of a greater whole, The Last Jedi is basically a film in its own right, something you're supposed to start and finish, and is seemingly only informed by the first movie of the trilogy, and will probably only inform the last. After all, if Rian Johnson really didn't care for what J.J. Abrams had done in Force Awakens and wanted to materially change the facts on the ground, then what does he expect J.J. Abrams to do in the ninth film of the series? It's just a jumbled mess, and the lack of a unifying vision really significantly hurts this film. Now, the second strand of the plot that was aforementioned involves Rey, of course, in her Return of the Jedi style search for self and apotheosis. This plot, of course, culminates in Kylo Ren killing Snoke with a nasty little lightsaber trick, and then giving his offer of partnership to Rey. And characterization aside, in and of itself, this is not a huge problem, but it's the details that matter. Rather than as part of some larger arc, this plot really seems to me to be Rian Johnson finding a way to take out Snoke, to put Kylo in charge, and there's no sense of natural plotting about it. Rather, and I've used this word a lot, it's a contrivance. Rian simply wanted to remove two pieces from the board in Luke Skywalker and Snoke, and put Kylo Ren as the primary antagonist of the trilogy, which really left Rey in a bit of a lurch because her personal plot, her personal arc, doesn't really get developed all that much. The primary thrust of that particular arc was her parentage, which is completely hand-waved away by Rian Johnson. And yes, it did subvert expectations, and it was probably a very conscious thing. However, people watched Force Awakens, and that film did enough with this plot, introduced it as a mystery, to a point where it's not just subverting expectations, it's disappointing expectations. And it's trite. Yes, I get that it's a comment about how everyone's special and that it's a thematic choice, but it's poorly handled. This film is not isolated from Force Awakens. And in that context, Johnson's explanation was poorly conceived. So where does that leave us with the plot of The Last Jedi overall? Well, we don't know where we're going. How we got here was poorly paced, and I feel contrived in many different ways. I mean, there were entire plots in service of marketing considerations. The Last Jedi really suffers from the clash of visions between J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson. Resultingly, Johnson, who wrote the plot, seems to have written it as a film independent of its trilogy. I can't imagine Abrams has any good feelings left for Johnson after this one. All that said, let's move on to the characters for a moment. We're going to end up going through most of them, so we might as well start off with Mark Hamill's Luke Skywalker. Now, Hamill has not made his feelings on this character secret in any way, shape, or form. He has frequently derided the direction taken, and he, quote-unquote, fundamentally disagreed with Rian Johnson's choices in this matter. And I would tend to agree with Hamill on this one. Johnson went for a bitter, jaded Luke Skywalker, but also an unrecognizable one. And while some people might think of that as a good thing, this level of disconnect between the character you know and the character you see creates real dissonance. When we find out that it was his reaction to the darkness in Ben Solo that basically creates Kylo Ren, I felt extremely disappointed. I mean, here you have a character who knows exactly just how much darkness you can bring someone back from in his experiences with his own father. And yet his initial reaction to Ben Solo is to raise his lightsaber while Ben's sleeping, and for just a moment contemplate killing a defenseless child. Luke Skywalker certainly didn't end the way I thought he would. And then toward the end of the film, after a nonsensical exchange with R2-D2, Luke is basically the deus ex machina that saves the day. And that feels like way more of a nod to the character that Luke represents and was in the previous films, rather than a reflection of his role in this film. It tries its hand at being a respectful send-off, but in the end is nothing of the sort. We're talking about a poorly conceived, poorly written character who is there for one purpose only, and once that purpose is played out, is phased out completely. Not the outcome I had in mind for Luke, and certainly I think Mark Hamill would agree. Now, as to Rey, his erstwhile would-be student, really we're talking about a different set of problems. I mean, I think Daisy Ridley does a pretty good job. I don't know how much range she has, but in terms of the character that's established, I think she's fine in the role. My biggest problem with the Rey character is that there really is no arc. There is no sense of the heroic journey. If you think about how characters grow and develop, it's through adversity, it's through challenge, it's through being beaten and overcoming. Now you tell me, what challenges has Rey faced? What adversity has she had to really overcome in her journey hitherto? She's an effortlessly natural fighter, an effortlessly natural force user. I think the 3 days training she received from Luke really did very little for her. And then she encounters Snoke and gets absolutely manhandled by what is supposed to be, I guess, a far superior force user. Now, the only problem with that episode, of course, being that she is not the one that overcomes Snoke. It is, in fact, Kylo Ren. So where is her growth? Many people would call her a Mary Sue type character with all that entails. I don't know if I would. I think she is deeply inconsistent. In some instances, all-powerful, and others seemingly powerless, which screams of poor characterization on the part of Rian Johnson, who is the writing staff. And I mean, you can see a lot of that inability when it comes to Johnson's treatment of Kylo Ren and Rey's budding connection. Basically, it's fodder for the next movie. It's not really a point of tension or anything, it's just there. I think some people thought maybe there's some kind of depth to that, maybe perceiving that they must be related in some way, like the kind of connection that Luke and Leia feel. Maybe they're cousins, maybe they're brother and sister, but obviously none of that played out the way people envisioned. In the end, it was basically a vehicle to get Rey into the same throne room as Snoke so that there could be a culminating fight, and so that Kylo could make her an offer that she ends up refusing. If you ask me how her character actually develops in this film, I could not tell you. I don't know. I don't see it. She is exactly who she was. She's not any stronger or weaker. She's not really any different. She's learned nothing about her past that seemingly affects her in any real way. She's not even really any kind of antithesis to Luke at this stage, some kind of counterpart to a younger Luke who is hopeful and who sees the good in people. The good she sees in Kylo Ren seems to actually be non-existent, or perhaps buried so deep that we'll only really see it play out in the next film. But at this stage, and in the context of this movie, she really doesn't see a lot of development at all. And speaking of her soul twin for a second, Kylo Ren, I really no longer understand where this character is heading. In Force Awakens, you really got the sense that we were talking about a redemption arc. And to an extent, you see a part of that play out toward the start of The Last Jedi when he refuses, or he takes his finger off the trigger, to kill Leia Organa, his mother. But that's not really revisited in any way, shape, or form. He ends up becoming the ruler of the First Order and replaces Snoke in what's essentially a power play. His motivations seem to be extremely nihilistic, quote unquote, burn it all down. Where does this come from? In the first film of the trilogy, again, you get the sense that there is a revenge factor playing out, that he seems to be entranced by Darth Vader, by his grandfather, and wants to live up to the ideal that he represents. At this point, though, what's the road back for him? The only character that might have given the redemption arc some kind of traction was Snoke, who is purported to be the big bad of the series. Instead, that's not the case at all. In fact, we get Kylo Ren now representing the main antagonist as we head into the third and final film in the trilogy. JJ has his job cut out for him. if he tries to accomplish what he seemed to want to accomplish with Kylo Ren in the first film, he's going to have to do some real gymnastics, some real script magic. I think that's intriguing for all the wrong reasons, because really you just hoping to see a train wreck play out. And this is definitely not an Adam Driver problem. This is a Kylo Ren, the character problem. The other new characters in this trilogy are treated about as well. You've got Finn, for whom they essentially have to invent things to do. Hence the casino planet, the fight with Phasma, and of course the really ill-advised love story. Look, I'm not a professional scriptwriter, Ryan, but anytime you have a character saying, "I love you," less than 48 hours after having met the recipient of that, you should pump those brakes. And poor Rose, her grand gestures suicidally crashing into Finn to prevent Finn's suicide. Ugh. This is the sort of romantic black and white view of the world that you get when you're a very young child. But we'll do the thematic stuff in a bit. I want to stay concentrating on the characters for just a little while longer. Finn, as I said, lacks a purpose. Rose's only purpose is to be there with Finn, to give him a counterpart while he goes off on totally purposeless adventures. That fight with Phasma encapsulates all of that so neatly. You've got two ancillary characters that really play very little part in the story, the overall story. Two characters who are essentially there to be there. And in Phasma's case, that's particularly heinous. On StarWars.com, there's a hilarious little article called 5 Things You May Not Know About Phasma. And every single detail in that little article comes from either a novel, a recent novel, by Delilah Dawson, or a comic book series by Kelly Thompson and Marco Cicchetto. Thing is, though, you've got this character in the film, and the vast majority of its audience will not have read Miss Dawson's book or the comic book in question, and will have just seen this character who's been in 2 films now, tossed down a flame-filled chasm after a fight meant to be Finn's "I'm a cool character" moment. Please care about me. And yes, she is meant to be this generation's Boba Fett. The chief difference being that Boba Fett had an actual part to play in the story. What's Phasma's role? To get killed by Finn? Excellent. By the way, did you know her armor is an expression of loyalty built from the remnants of the Emperor's space yacht? Yeah, me neither. Frankly, it's amazing to me that they would create a character, go through all the trouble of hiring an actor with proven acting chops in a really decent Game of Thrones performance, and then do absolutely nothing with that character. I kind of want to know what they promised Gwendolyn Christie when they were doing the casting. I want to know if they promised her a greater role in the film than she got. Instead, what she got were a couple of lines and essentially having her eyes shown after her helmet was blown to pieces. And while we're on that villainous note, it's probably worth talking a little bit about General Hux. Was this character conceived as comic relief? I don't think so. I think they've got this high-strung villain that they intended to be in some way intimidating or analogous to Grand Moff Tarkin. But again, this is probably a situation in which Johnson's vision clashes with Abrams' vision, and what you end up getting is a totally dissonant character. He's certainly not intimidating. You don't see him as a threat to the Resistance or to any of the characters involved. Certainly not Poe Dameron. And neither is he effective as comic relief. He's just really neither here nor there. Written as nothing in particular, and ending up very, very purposeless. Again, very purposeless. And totally disposable. I don't understand why he's a named character at this point. And on that note, Supreme Leader Snoke falls afoul of much of the same problem. The Force Awakens kind of builds this mystery around his identity, what his motivations are, who he really, really is in a more essential way. And then The Last Jedi just completely eliminates him from the conversation. Johnson again doesn't care for the hanging plot thread, so he quite literally kills it by having Kylo Ren cut Supreme Leader Snoke in half with a lightsaber. And what it ends up feeling like is that this character is only there, only in the story, because he's an inescapable artifact of The Force Awakens. In effect, The Last Jedi really doesn't have any kind of compelling antagonist. No one who is actually anywhere near on par with either the Emperor or Darth Vader. Now, on a final note when it comes to the characters, let's take a moment to consider Laura Dern's Admiral Holdo and Admiral Akbar. I guess I really don't understand why Ryan felt the need to create an entirely new character whose role really is to usurp lines from Leia Organa to be her mouthpiece, and at the same time to steal Admiral Akbar's final send-off. If you're trying to be respectful to the characters of the original trilogy and trying to give Luke's legacy the respect it deserves in his final scenes, then why, oh why, did you kill off Admiral Akbar off screen? Did a better character or a better candidate really exist for carrying out that, very pivotal suicide assault on Snoke's flagship? I would have thought that would have been the perfect way to send off one of Star Wars' most iconic characters. Instead, we have Laura Dern's Holdo in this role, who the LA Times described as Star Wars LGBTQ heroine. And I struggle to understand why this character was included, unless we consider it a jointly marketing and ideological move, wherein the film becomes a vehicle for ham-fisted political messages. Look, I understand the thematic counter-argument that in some ways The Last Jedi's message is about inclusiveness, and Laura Dern's Holdo plays a key role in that. But was the Vice Admiral really the best way to include that message? Ask yourself, if you take away the loaded political imagery, including the purple hair of the character, which seems just completely out of place, I don't know why they included that detail, ideological considerations aside, does the character stand up in its own right? My answer is not even remotely. Here, Johnson's playing with political semiotics that are just, again, so transparent, so incredibly awkward that it denudes the film of its quality. I think the people who like this character, and with all due respect to them, like it more for the message of inclusiveness that it delivers than what it actually does for the movie. Holdo becomes a box for people to place meaning in, their own meaning, their own interpretations of what Star Wars is about and the messages that it has for the wider community, and a sense of, yeah, this is for me too. But like I said before, the notion that Star Wars has to be something for everybody and have something for everybody is flawed. I think it's a great challenge for any filmmaker to include this kind of political conversation in what's essentially an adventure film. And unfortunately for Rian Johnson, he fails to live up to that challenge pretty spectacularly. And I think this point gives us a great segue into the next part of our conversation, which is basically to do with the thematic approaches taken in this film. And I think there are about 4 that are just readily identifiable. We've got Johnson basically setting up 3 juxtapositions. Firstly, the old versus the new. Secondly, a sort of social justice versus capitalism theme that is just fraught with problems. And of course, the classic idea of rebellion versus authority, with the underlying theme of hope and love just sprinkled liberally throughout. I don't necessarily think that the first or the third of those juxtapositions are problematic. There was not going to be any kind of potential in this film wherein they'd stick to the old. Of course, they were going to create a Star Wars for a new generation. Of course, the new trilogy is basically aimed at having a generation of people grow up with Star Wars the way so many of us in our 30s and 40s did. My big issue with Johnson's thematic approach is that it's just very clumsy and clumsily handled. He's not really building bridges to the future, he's burning down the past in a lot of cases, and thereby making this old versus new theme very, very awkward. Primarily in terms of looking at some of the characters that the series is transitioning out of. In particular, Luke Skywalker, Admiral Akbar, etc. The endings applied to the old, in this case, are just so abrupt. Almost as if Johnson wanted a sort of blank slate, a blank canvas to have the third film in the trilogy built on. I don't think a single character death was handled gracefully or skillfully or really creatively. I mean, how do you not situate Luke for his final showdown with Kylo Ren? How do you not put him in that place? Why do you have to create this incredibly convoluted excuse to have him there? Why not write him into a situation in which he is standing there in front of those AT-ATs, deflecting laser bolts, turbo lasers, whatever, and going down in a glorious last stand? I mean, you're writing a space opera. You know, it is way better to burn out than fade away. And the fact that Luke Skywalker literally faded away just kills me. And honestly, this tabula rasa approach extends to the entire film. As I've mentioned a number of times earlier, Johnson basically resets the film. Though the pattern here is Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, what we end up with is the start of A New Hope. Think about it. There are no resolutions or setups to be had here. There is only a ragtag rebellion up against a powerful empire. And how can you do that to your audience? They've spent time, money, emotion, and patience on what is essentially a holding action, an opportunity to clean up loose ends without actually moving the greater plot anywhere, or furthering any character arc. If Rian Johnson had any control over this process at all, and I believe to an extent that he did, it really does a great disservice to him as a director and a filmmaker. It just reeks of amateurism and baby's first franchise film. And while we're on that amateurish point, boy oh boy do the politics of this film make my skin crawl. You really can't have it both ways, Ryan. It cannot be simultaneously that this is rebellion versus authority if you're also saying that the authority doesn't really matter. What's really at stake is this unbridled capitalism that underpins said authority. And the audience is treated to a gutful of that on the casino planet, where sob stories are used to tug at emotional heartstrings, while the rich lose themselves in debauchery and excess. But if I look at that and couple it with Benicio del Toro's DJ's expose of who supplies arms to whom, and then again consider that Kylo Ren talks about burning down the whole structure because it's all rotten anyway and who cares, what's the natural conclusion? I don't know. To me, Star Wars is not the place for a conversation about social justice or capitalism. Look, I mean, it should be about rebelling against injustice and degradation, but again, just the clumsiness, the awkwardness of the product delivered. How can you go on this diatribe, Brian, when you're selling porgs as basically living soft toys and at the same time giving us mood rings that are available at our nearest good toy retailer? Don't you get the feeling that it's a bit of a sham? This is the most merchandised franchise in film history. And you want to talk about capitalistic excess. It is totally explicable that many of the scenes the film is justly criticized for and stringently criticized for are to do with this particular theme. It just doesn't work on any level, and quite frankly, it's embarrassing for all involved. Now, as for the hope and love motif, well, that of course has its place in Star Wars lore, in franchise tradition, and on its own and in its own right would be fine. But again, the film just doesn't do it justice and isn't skillful about delivering. One of the most pivotal skills in filmmaking is the ability to show rather than tell, and yet the audience is told on at least 3 separate occasions that hope and love are what bind the good people of the galaxy together. I mean, what is this, a Saturday morning cartoon? Pick your audience, Ryan. You cannot defeat positive emotions or the people who experience them. It's all just so juvenile. And that's really the biggest crime here. There is very little respect for the intelligence or the cognitive capacity of the audience, with material delivery that borders on the disingenuous. I had to suppress a laugh when I heard Holdo say, well, as Leia Organa would put it, so why doesn't she put it? I mean, I know she is recovering from a little spacewalk at that point, but that needs better writing. That doesn't require a Holdo. In fact, here's an idea. Instead of telling people what the theme of the film is, just show them. But again, you get the sense that Johnson had to put in something for everybody, that everyone had to get something out of the film, and that to make sure that everybody understood exactly what the film was talking about, you had to tell them. Particularly because you're delivering that message to ostensibly 6 to 15-year-olds. I'd like to take a moment to just remind the nice people at Disney Company and the cast and crew of the films they produce that the original trilogy gained a legion of young fans without talking down to them. Just give them a beautifully shot movie with an immersive world, characters that are interesting and do great things, and a plot that makes the whole thing come together, and you'll see positive results. You'll get your fans, and yes, you will get your money. All that said, I suppose it's as good a time as any to capstone this with something positive. At the very least, Rian Johnson's cinematography is excellent. I think the movie is just really well shot. The CGI effects, for the most part, are fantastic. Everything feels very Star Wars. I enjoyed that aspect of the film, and I thought the palettes they used worked really, really well. Even if many of the design choices when it came to the uniforms, the starships, etc., were needlessly familiar. If you're going to make a break with the past, then break with the past. At least in this sense, where nobody's going to hold a gun to your head over uniform design, for the simple reason that it doesn't materially impact the film. It's purely an aesthetic choice. So yeah, I guess it's fitting that the film's best feature, the film's best aspect, is the veneer, the plastic covering that covers a very plastic, very ersatz, very hollow product. One that Rian Johnson is getting critically acclaimed for, but rightfully lambasted by its target audience. I'm not ashamed to admit that The Last Jedi, when I look at it as a feature, broke my heart a little bit. And while I want to hope that the third film in the trilogy will be better, and that the trilogy that follows will be better still, I just don't have it at this stage. I don't trust Disney. I don't trust them with this franchise, and I think they've hurt the franchise in really, really disconcerting ways. And I think that will be my sign-off. Thank you for listening to an unduly lengthy video. I hope you got something out of it. Be well, and until next time.